welcome to this evening together. Can you hear me all right? No? I guess, Nick, turn me up. Or don't beam me up, just turn me up. Thank you. Thanks very much. Well, welcome to this conversation on inclusiveness and the future of the United Methodist Church. It's sponsored by the Reconciling Conversations group here. I'm Bill Everett. With Louis Pogue sitting here, we convene that Reconciling Conversations group. We're delighted tonight to have two friends with us who can help light up some of the pathways ahead for us locally as well as in the worldwide church. Before we begin, I want us to take a moment to remember our dear friend and co-worker for justice, Hattie Polk, who died in peace on Monday after 96 years of being one of God's drum majors for justice. Her vivacious personality and insight inspired us all, no more so than when she told us about her granddaughter Hannah and her courageous affirmation of her lesbian identity and her forthcoming marriage. Hattie's story became the inspiration for the book of stories we published in 2015 entitled Journeying Toward Reconciliation. Copies of the book are here tonight if you don't have one. This little book has ended up having a tremendous impact on people around the world, encouraging them to have voice and forge new pathways of reconciliation in their own families, churches, and communities. Her spirit continues with us tonight. I was able to be with her last Tuesday as she was slipping away from this life. As I held her hand, she told me she was seeing a beautiful peony before her, opening its petals to receive her. I've tried to put this experience into words. Hattie leaned into God's garden gate. Looking over the weathered wood and iron, she saw a peony, she told me, opening its smile, its arms, surrendering its sweet bouquet, the ants receiving its libations to the sun. She smiled, she laughed, she opened up her arms as it embraced her in a love that filled the whole garden. She danced into its warm embrace, exclaiming, "Peony, sweet peony." And so in Hattie's spirit, we begin our conversation tonight. Helen Ride, whose infectious English accent, humor, and expansive vision have inspired and guided us over many years now, is our regional organizer for Reconciling Ministries Network and is a home missioner with the United Methodist Church. On my left, Bishop Charlene Kammerer served as bishop here and in Virginia. Since her so-called retirement, she has been very active among us and in the wider church, seeking to advance its inclusive reach and work of reconciliation. Helen will begin our evening with a presentation on recent developments in the Reconciling Ministries Network. And then Charlene will help us understand what is happening in the wider United Methodist Church as we seek to move together into a more inclusive future. We are joined tonight by people who are watching this online as well as you yourselves who are here. We will open up the conversation to your comments and questions after they've had their presentations and perhaps a brief exchange between them. And then we will close off our time at 8:30. So I hope that you will be filled with new information, insight, and inspiration tonight.
I'll hold on to it. Well, good evening, friends. It is absolutely a joy to be back at First United Methodist in Waynesville. I said to Bishop Camera earlier, I do believe this might be the church that I have visited or spoken at the most since I've been an organizer with the Reconciling Ministers Network. I think it might be. I went back and looked. I have one vivid recollection of maybe my first time speaking here. We were in the room off of the room where we were before. I know it has a name, but I don't know what the name is. There you go. And Bill and the others had invited me to come and talk about General Conference 2016. And so I was in the middle of my presentation about General Conference 2016, doing my best to appear as though I knew what I was talking about. And a hand goes up in the audience and says, do you mind, I have a couple of things maybe to add? And of course, please feel free. My name is Charlene Camera. I'm a bishop of the United Methodist Church. And I just about, if you were there, you remember, because I think I may have screamed out loud or something. But I looked at Bill and I said, Bill, explain to me why you have invited me to explain about General Conference 2016 when you have a bishop in the room. So anyway, that was where I met Bishop Camera, and I am now thrilled to call her a beloved friend and kind of one of my bosses at RMN, because Bishop Camera is now on our board, and I'm really grateful for her and her years of witness and hopes and prayers and work for an inclusive church. So I'm really grateful that I know the bishop is right here behind me this evening. So I know most of you here are probably familiar with RMN, but some are not. So I'm just going to give you a brief summary, and it's always good to put your glasses on when you're trying to read something. We work for justice and inclusion for all LGBTQ people in the United Methodist Church and beyond. We've been doing it since 1984. In 1984, Affirmation, which was the organization that gave birth to RMN, formed the Reconciling Congregations Program. And at the end of the General Conference that year, which was in Baltimore that year in Maryland, they launched the Reconciling Congregations Program with a goal to move the work for inclusion into the grassroots of the denomination. And that was an invitation to people to see if their church might like to become a reconciling church. And by the end of 1984, we had 8 reconciling churches in the United States. Now, over 30 years later, the reconciling movement spans 4 continents, over 1,300 churches and communities, and over 40,000 individuals. And we're still growing, and love is still growing, and inclusion is still growing. And I'm grateful that one of those reconciling communities for a long time now has been at this church. So the last couple of years have been interesting, have they not? I started 2020 anticipating General Conference in May, traveling as I had been doing for several years across the Southeast jurisdiction. I actually went through to see where I had been. I went to Gainesville, Georgia. I was in 7 cities and towns in Mississippi. I was in Alabama for the Academy of Spiritual Formation, Florida for anti-racism training, and to Nashville 3 separate times, 2 for delegate-related meetings and 1 for RMN's Connection 2020. And then on March the 10th, everything ground to a halt. And Mrs. Lovely, who is in the audience with us, poor Love, who had been very used to having quite a bit of time and space to herself for the previous several years, suddenly had me at home constantly. I'll leave you to ask her whether that was a good thing or a bad thing. So we also, at that point, we moved to Sunset Beach, North Carolina, We're now splitting our time between there and here. We have a condo now at Lake Junaluska. For some reason, at the beginning of the pandemic, I decided that talking to people on Facebook Live about British nonsense and baking was a great idea. And so I did a little bit of that, which was kind of fun. And we started doing our work online. We had to shift, we had to pivot to doing our work online. Now I know that folks who work in churches, their pivot to a new way of doing things had to happen really, really quickly. And at RMN, we had a little bit more time to figure that out, for which I'm grateful. But it did take us a while to regroup and to figure out what were the implications of the pandemic on our work. Obviously, all our meetings went online. We began to offer virtual worship services. We began to offer virtual porch gatherings, which were essentially online spaces for conversation and discussion and training and so on. And all of those are, by the way, still available on our website. Virtual worship, now we are doing worship resources for folks. So we've shifted from providing an online service virtually to now providing information for folks to help with their resources for church. And that is also on the website. And we shifted to a stronger focus on all kinds of resourcing for the movement, and that work is still in process. We're partnering with another group to create these resources, and as with many new things, it's taking a little longer than we anticipated, but we are hoping the first round of video resources will be available in June. Also, in the last couple of years, we launched what we called Rooted and Rising. The early months of 2020 not only brought us the challenge of the pandemic, but also a stark reminder of the generations-long systemic prevalence of anti-black violence in this country, with the deaths of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd. And Rooted and Rising was launched to reconnect us with the importance of our grassroots work and to reinforce a deeper commitment to intersectional justice. So what we learned during that was that launching a campaign during a global pandemic is hard and maybe not a great idea. We knew it would be challenging, but honestly we underestimated the impact of COVID stress on all of the folks that we relied upon to engage with our work. You know, we were trying to adapt, and you all were trying to adapt where you are, and people were just in kind of coping mode. And so launching a new campaign at that time was maybe not the greatest idea. However, you know, we felt it was the right thing to do at the time. The other thing that we learned from this experience was introducing the new language of Rooted and Rising can be confusing. When you start using new language for things, people think it's something entirely new, and really it wasn't entirely new. It was a reinforcement of what we'd always been doing and a recommitment to what we'd always been doing. We also took a different tack on how we launched the campaign. We gave people the option to opt in to hearing about it, and therefore the option not to opt in to hearing about it. And so we kind of narrowed down the number of people who ended up hearing about it because we didn't want to inundate folks with emails, and that kind of had some unintended consequences too. So it's good to do things and learn things, and maybe a global pandemic is the perfect time to try something new and learn from it. I don't know. But what we're doing for sure, moving forward, is we're keeping our commitment to intersectional justice. We have introduced a new required foundational reconciling statement. So new groups that go through the reconciling process, we now ask them to affirm a single statement that is the same everywhere. And we're inviting existing reconciling groups, so this might be something for this group to consider. We're inviting existing reconciling groups to affirm the new statement too. You know, when RMN first started, the requirements for a reconciling statement just included the language of welcome and the language of sexual orientation when we first started. As we moved through and learned more things, we added the language of gender identity. So we were welcoming people of all sexual orientations and gender identities. And then we learned a little bit more. And we learned that actually welcome isn't enough. We need to welcome and affirm people of all sexual orientations and gender identities. And we have for a long time strongly encouraged churches and groups to include other ways in which people get marginalized in their reconciling statements. That's something we have encouraged for many years. But in 2020, we realized that giving people the option not to do that wasn't okay. That if we are going to truly work for the LGBTQ justice for all LGBTQ people, then we need to encourage people to understand that LGBTQ people are also people of every race and ethnicity, immigration status, education status, economic situation. So we have to, and when we think about our reconciling work, we have to think about it holistically. And that's why we introduced the new foundational reconciling statement, which I'm going to read to you now. So this is what we ask all of our new reconciling churches and groups to vote on. We celebrate God's gift of diversity and value the wholeness made possible in community, equally shared and shepherded by all. We welcome and affirm people of every gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation, who are also of every age, race, ethnicity, physical and mental ability, level of education and family structure, and of every economic, immigration, marital, and social status, and so much more. We acknowledge that we live in a world of profound social, economic, and political inequities. As followers of Jesus, we commit ourselves to the pursuit of justice and pledge to stand in solidarity with all who are marginalized and oppressed. And that's the statement that we have as the foundational statement now for all our reconciling groups. So we've extended that invitation to existing groups to adopt that, and we're gradually working through sending that invitation out and following up and so on. That's a long process. And we've continued our commitment to grassroots work, especially in forming regional groups in areas where we have little reconciling presence. And as we go through this next stage in our denominational situation, which Bishop Cameron is going to speak to in a minute, these regional groups are going to become more and more important, because we are going to have parts of the country where we don't and won't have a reconciling presence. We may not even have United Methodist churches, many United Methodist churches. So our commitment is especially towards forming these regional groups. And the other thing we're keeping going forward is the Wellspring. The Wellspring is the program that we launched during Rooted and Rising, encouraging monthly donors to Reconciling Ministries Network. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Bishop Cameron.
Thank you, Helen. And I'm aware that we've had some additional persons come into the room and join us, so we want to welcome you on behalf of the Reconciling Congregations Group here at First Waynesville. And it's good to be together this evening. Also, just a reminder that after my part of the presentation, that Dr. Everett will invite you to ask questions for clarity or information that you might have, and will guide us through that. And our end time is set for 8:30, so we've tried to carefully shepherd the stewardship of our time together this evening. I also want to express appreciation for this opportunity this evening. I especially want to affirm Helen Ride in her regional organizing work for Reconciling Ministries Network. As a member of the board of directors now, I have seen close and up personal her work, her spirit, and her advocacy always at the forefront, and we are very grateful for the many and strong gifts she brings to this work. Helen has an ability and a gift to connect with so many different types of people and to help move the work forward, and we thank God for her. I thank Dr. Everett for his planning, convening, and encouraging this gathering tonight, and those of you who have long-term been part of the reconciling movement and congregational efforts in our congregation here. When talking about the presentation tonight with Bill Everett, he mentioned the word snapshot to me of where we are in the United Methodist Church around the issues of separation and disaffiliation. Now, those are two words that prior to this season in our denomination, I have not heard describing the United Methodist Church, separation and disaffiliation. But here we are. And so I realized from my recent conversation with Bill that the snapshot is something helpful to focus on, because I can only provide a snapshot because that snapshot keeps changing through the weeks, through the months, and through the many delays of our denomination to try to have an in-person general conference. So I can offer gladly my insights and knowledge as of today from the lens of being active in the Council of Bishops. Indeed, this week we are meeting as a global body from 9 a.m. Eastern Time to 1 p.m. every day. So my head is full of information right now, and every day and every session of our meeting is always intense. When I say we meet from 9 to 1, that means some of us are meeting at 3 and 4 a.m., and some of us are gathering at 4 or 5 or 6 a.m. in order to be together. And I believe that reflects the commitment of your bishops in this church to do our administrative shepherding and prophetic work together, even in time of pandemic. So, what do we know as of today? Legal documents will be filed on May 1st, Sunday, to formally launch the Global Methodist Church. And we call that GMC, not General Motors Company, but Global Methodist Church. Congregations who have already disaffiliated and who have indicated that they will be coming or have completed that process in their annual conferences will be in the first wave of United Methodist congregations making that choice. There has been in place a transitional leadership council of the Global Methodist Church, and that body will vote in their own fashion on receiving these congregations. The bishops have been told that they will not receive churches until those churches have completed the process of withdrawal in their annual conferences. Now, I want you to know that our judicial council, which some of us kind of think about like the Supreme Court in our church structure, the bishops have sent two important questions to them to be answered, and we have asked that body of 9 persons to expedite their decision. We have yet to receive the answers to these two questions, but we hope that we will have them sometime within this month. The first is, can an annual conference disaffiliate from the United Methodist Church? In the work and planning of the Global Methodist Church, it has been shared and teaching is in place across the Methodist system that is possible, and annual conferences might make that choice. The bishops, by a huge majority, do not agree with that interpretation. We believe that that would be unconstitutional for us as a church body and denomination. It is the annual conference that is the basic unit of United Methodism. It is not the local church, it is not general conference, it is the annual conference from the time of John Wesley forward. The second question we are waiting to hear the answer to is, may the jurisdictional conferences, which will happen this November, elect bishops. Now, we've been postponed from having U.S. and jurisdictional conferences and gatherings of central conferences where bishops are also elected because of the pandemic. Traditionally, the regional or jurisdictional conferences have not met until after a general conference. So the bishops of your church have called, which is in our purview, these jurisdictional conferences November 2 through 5. They all happen the same days, the same time frame in the different regions of the U.S. We will have our gathering at Lake Junaluska this fall. And we know at least the purpose of this body, in addition to Bible study, fellowship, worship, teaching, will be to allow bishops to retire who have been serving past their date of retirement by the Book of Discipline due to the exigencies of the pandemic, and to assign bishops. There is nothing in the discipline that prevents the assignment or reassignment of bishops during this time. And there will need to be changes made, either retiring bishops replaced or current bishops taking more than one area. So we know those things can and will happen this November. What we would like to also see happen is the capacity to elect new bishops for the church. The cycle of central conferences, and that simply means United Methodist presence outside the U.S., in Europe, in the Philippines, and in Africa. Those conferences always have a different cycle, have always had a different cycle. Their annual conferences are meeting now, and they meet all the way through to November. So their central conferences where new bishops get elected in those contexts also need urgently to happen. And our question framed to the Judicial Council includes that consideration, of course, for our Central Conference colleagues. So we are eager to hear these determinations of the Judicial Council that will help guide us even more specifically about those important moments ahead for us. Now, prior to May 1st, it's our understanding as the Council of Bishops that any pastors currently who will be choosing to withdraw from the denomination in order to unite with the Global Methodist Church will need to withdraw formally written request to the conference and the bishop, and at the same time surrender their clergy credentials. You cannot remain a member as clergy of both the United Methodist Church and the Global Methodist Church, or any other church body. So we expect that we will have some of these surrenders of credentials within the next week or so, and we will wait to see what the landscape of that looks like for us as a whole church. This also includes clergy in extension ministries, things like chaplaincies, teachers in higher education settings, seminary teachers, health professionals, anyone who's ordained clergy and appointed to a setting beyond the local church includes extension ministry. Now here's one curious thing about this movement. Churches and pastors might not be moving the same way simultaneously. A local church might be following a process of discernment and make a decision to withdraw from the United Methodist Church, but their pastor might choose to stay, or vice versa. This is possible. Other churches are heading to their annual conference session with the intention of departing. They have gone through all the steps required, and a formal vote will happen at the session of their annual conference. May the 1st is a threshold date, but there is no finish date to receive local churches. Now I want to say a word about the Wesleyan Covenant Association, WCA, because that group has declared they intend to remain active in the United Methodist Church, even beyond the launching of the Global Methodist Church. And their president of the Transitional Leadership Council, Reverend Keith Boyette, has said, "We do not intend for the WCA to have a long life. However, our purpose will be to help people find a home if they feel they do not have one. It will have a role in our convening conference and a role in helping United Methodist churches clarify their intent and direction." Now that quote reveals that there will be a convening general conference of the Global Methodist Church within a year of this May 1st date, where that new church body will adapt its constitution, its book of doctrine and discipline, and so forth. The WCA still holds a viable role for those who desire to stay until we do have a general conference or beyond. So we will see how that kind of plays out, but this is word that the bishops have received from the leaders of the Wesleyan Covenant Association. Now back to the words disaffiliation and separation. If you go to an annual conference meeting this year as a delegate or as a guest, you will hear this being discussed probably in some plenary or around the edges or conversation in the hallways. There are 3 paragraphs in the current Book of Discipline that relate to a church, a United Methodist Church, disaffiliating from the denomination. And it is at this point that bishops, some district superintendents, boards of church location in the districts, that has to do with properties, establishing new properties, guidelines, etc., and conference trustees, that has to do with local church properties. All of those leader groups are involved in at least 2 of these 3 paragraphs. And what the bishops have tried to do is to be transparent in our working with the leaders of the Global Methodist Church as it emerges, with our General Council on Finance and Administration, and with our pension body, which is now called WestPath, because it is indeed our obligation as your elected leaders to preserve the United Methodist Church and to continue to help us all embrace our core values of grace, mission, connection, diversity, stewardship of our properties, and our resources. Your bishops are committed to this. Part of the paragraph 2553, which is the newest provision in the Book of Discipline. In fact, it was voted on at the called 2019 General Conference in St. Louis. It was heavily lobbied by the more conservative members of our church, both lay and clergy. And this provision passed. And it is that is guiding your bishops and the church in setting the parameters of what is required when a local church decides to disaffiliate. So please do not be dissuaded that the bishops are trying to punish people or churches. This legislation came to General Conference, was heavily debated, and it was adopted as a standard form of practice for what would be required. Some of these things include apportionment payments. In other words, as a local church, if you have not paid your apportionment payments 100%, you would not be eligible to be considered to disaffiliate. Your property cannot become your own unless all liabilities against that property have been cleared and addressed, or a way to provide for the payments. It also includes pension liabilities, because as the local church, you are a partner in helping pay for the pensions of all past, current, and future United Methodist preachers. From our inception, this has been a core value and commitment to take care of the worn-out preachers in the Methodist Church. And we have been abundantly successful in that regard, including fully funding pensions for our brothers and sister clergy outside the U.S. Now, that legislation also had a sentence in it that said the annual conference also has a right to develop other standard terms as long as they don't conflict with the ones I just mentioned: apportionment payments, property matters, pension obligations, and a conference can have additional ones. So that came to the body from the very conservative delegates of the conference. And we need to be clear that's where that came from. It is not coming from the current Council of Bishops. It's not coming from leaders in annual conferences or conference staff or DS or clergy or laity. That is the source of that standard that we're using. Now, at a regular or called session of the annual conference, it is that body that has the right to approve a church's request to disaffiliate, and it requires a majority vote, 50% plus 1 of all the delegates present and voting. And that step must be completed before a church can disaffiliate. There might be some local churches who have, as we might say, gone rogue and already claim to have disaffiliated without doing these steps. Technically, that can't happen. Now, it doesn't mean that church won't leave. It doesn't mean that church is willing to put up a legal fight for years into the future to determine if they own that church and property-wise and so forth. But these steps must be honored all the same across the U.S. Now, I say the U.S. because in the central conferences, it's still a surprise to many United Methodists that they have their own books of discipline. Most all of it is the same, or very much the same, as our book of discipline that we have in the U.S. But they have always had the right to make changes because of their context and ministry, where they're located. For instance, if countries in Africa don't have clergy who have the ability financially or otherwise to travel to a seminary to get their degrees, there are other ways you can become credentialed that are appropriate and helpful and good for the cause of Christian mission that don't follow what we require from our Board of Ordained Ministry, the long process of that. There are other provisions for contextuality about their mission settings. They have more leeway to partner with ecumenical and sometimes interfaith groups because their presence in Europe particularly is much lower in numbers than that in the rest of the UMC, but they're very respected and their voices are appreciated from not only faith groups, but at the highest levels of government. The United Methodist voice continues to be heard. So once all the conference will or will not approve a church's request for disaffiliation, then it still has to go to the annual conference trustees, and that body will execute the agreements, making sure that the local church has faithfully responded and cared for by action each of the steps enclosed. I hope that's helpful and not too, I hope you can understand most of what I've said. And it's a lot more complex, of course. And I think our journey of postponement keeps making it messier, keeps making it more complex, and keeps making it murkier as we look ahead, because none of us can really say what's going to happen. And we're living in a very unique and burdened and prophetic time in the life of our church. To me, it's very sad that we're even talking about separating. Monday, our bishops heard 3 very moving presentations, 2 from retired bishops and 1 from our General Secretary on Archives and History. And each of them spoke to other times in our history where there has been a separation. One is from an African American bishop, one is from a Mexican American bishop who still continues to do work in Latin America on our behalf, and one a historian, all of whom lived this movement, this history, and love our United Methodist Church. It is sad to acknowledge that most of the separations in the United States, race was always the cause. It was always the issue that people continued to struggle with, bishops continued to struggle with, general conferences continued to struggle with, and adopt legislation that either continued to separate African Americans from the full life of our church or to marginalize different groups of people. So it was very painful and helpful and revelatory for us to be together as this history was recaptured and renamed for us as we look ahead. Now I'm going to ask my spouse, Lee, if he would share an insert that I want you to have. You don't really need to read it now, but you can take it home with you. And if you would just take one per household, that would probably help. We have a really good turnout tonight. And I'll explain what this is. There are three very dedicated, long-term, active United Methodists in the Western Pennsylvania Conference. Their headquarters is Pittsburgh. They have, over a period of time, analyzed the book of doctrines and disciplines that will guide the the Global Methodist Church when they have their convening conference and into the future. And on the back page of this handout, you will see a link if you want the whole 25-page analysis. It's extremely well done. It has a section on what local churches need to know, a section for what annual conferences need to know, a section on implications of the language, and it particularly focuses around questions of inclusion and what the new discipline for the Global Methodist Church will look like in that regard. Who will be included? Who will not? Will there be guaranteed appointments for clergy, regardless of racial, ethnic status, regardless of physical ability, regardless of what your first language is, regardless of your age, etc. Will there be guaranteed a place for called and experienced and vetted clergy women to continue serving as pastors and leaders in the church? Will there be a place not only of membership but leadership at all levels of the church for LGBTQ plus persons? So this is, 2 or 3 classes minimally to get through this document, but I found it so helpful, and a lot of the bishops are sharing it with their people, and I wanted you to have it. It gives you the links where you can go and find out that information. Now you're going to see 2 acronyms here. It says page 21 because that's what was in the document. I just gave you like the executive summary of the document, feeling that would be the most helpful. It's just 4 pages plus the references. TBDD stands for Transitional Book of Doctrines and Disciplines. That's the one that's being tweaked, from now until their convening general conference. DBDD stands for Draft Book of Doctrine and Disciplines. So that's their internal language that has been reflected faithfully, I think, in this report. So these are some things I thought would be helpful for you to know, and as we get down to more granular levels of local church responsibilities and options, or annual conference, or the role of bishops in all this, I'm pleased to try to answer your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bishop. So, it's a lot, isn't it? This denominational mess, the continued harm wrought on LGBTQ plus people, the bone-deep fatigue from the COVID pandemic. And I don't want us to underestimate the harm of May 1st, the launching of a denomination which is steadfast in denying the full humanity of LGBTQ plus people. It's not something that's needed. We don't even need a Wesleyan version of it. We already have those. There are Wesleyan denominations that deny the full humanity of LGBTQ plus people already. but we're going to have another one. And I don't know about you, but that weight's really heavy on my heart. So I wanted just to take a minute actually to pause and reflect on this moment that we're in, because I've been having to pause and reflect myself on a regular basis, and to consider, and I don't know if I'm alone in this, but I guess probably not, but is this still worth it? There are some days when I wonder, you know, I wonder if there's still work to be done. And the good news is, on most days, I think, yes, I do believe this is still work to be done. This work for full inclusion in the United Methodist Church, for the acknowledgement, the affirmation of the full humanity, and that's what we're talking about here, right? We talk about, can people be married, or can people follow their call to ministry? But what this is really about is, are LGBTQ plus people fully human like non-LGBTQ plus people? That's what's at the essence of this. So I believe this work that the reconciling group here does, that this church has been doing, that other reconciling churches and groups across this country and beyond, is still extremely critical work. We are still saving lives. And I believe that the United Methodist Church can still make a difference. I asked the office, the conference office, for a spreadsheet of all the physical locations of the map of the churches in the Western North Carolina Conference. And I imported them into a map on Google Maps. And I'm a bit of a map nerd. I love maps. The advent of digital maps is just a wonder to me. But when you zoom out on this Google map and you see the number of map markers where there are United Methodist churches just in the Western North Carolina Conference. I didn't do the other conferences. It's amazing. Even when you kind of zoom in, you have to zoom in quite a long way before they start separating out. And there are some spots where you have to, even when you're fairly close in, you can still see a whole bunch of markers. And I still believe, and I've probably said it here before, that if the United Methodist Church can get this next stage right, then we still have the possibility of doing what we said we are called to do, which is to transform the world. We can still be a church that shifts the perspective of people of faith, particularly Christians, on LGBTQ people. So I think God is still at work, and there's still work to be done. But I also understand that this takes some perseverance. And I've been reading a little book. It was mentioned on a Brene Brown podcast. I'm a big podcast person. She mentioned a quote by an unnamed CEO of a nonprofit who was a nonprofit that was working in Houston after Hurricane Ike. And she said, every day I have to make a choice not to give up. And so Margaret Wheatley, in this little book here, expands on this, and I just want to read it to you because it spoke to me. The little chapter is called Choosing. Perseverance is a choice. It's not a simple one-time choice. It's a daily one. There's never a final decision. When I'm talking about choice now, I want you to be thinking about your role in this moment in the life of the United Methodist Church. We're all United Methodists, most of us, I think, in this room. And we all, if we choose, have a part to play in this moment in the life of the church. So we all have a choice. It's a daily one. There's never a final decision. Our first yes was filled with energy and enthusiasm. And I can say that's true. When I first got my job at RMN, I was like, yes, this is it. This makes sense of the whole of the rest of my life. It's purposeful work. We're going to change the world. Everybody is going to love the gays, even the people in churches. I was very excited. So our first yes is filled with energy and enthusiasm. And it brought us here. But it is of no use as the waters rise and the turbulence increases. By the time we're surrounded by obstacles and opposition, by aggression and mean-spiritedness, our initial choice has no meaning if we can even remember that optimistic moment. And this is as it should be. Having to make a choice every day keeps us alert and present. Do I have the resources, internal and external, to keep going? Can I deal with what's in front of me right now? Do I have any patience left? Depends on the day. Is there a way through this mess? These critical questions require a momentary pause, a little reflection. Rather than just striking out or being reactive to a bad day, we offer ourselves freedom. Do I continue or do I give up? Even a brief pause creates the space for freedom. We're not trapped by circumstances or fatigue. We give ourselves a moment to look as clearly as we can at the current situation, and then we make a conscious choice every day. And so, my conscious choice every day is that I can still make a difference. In fact, this notion of an individual being able to make a difference was at the core of what led me to faith in Christ. The fact that God could talk to a person and send a person in a direction to help another person or to help another situation, that story is what captivated and revolutionized my understanding of what it meant to be a Christian. It came through the story of David Wilkerson in the book The Cross and the Switchblade, that a skinny rural preacher from Pennsylvania should see a photo on the cover of Life magazine of some boys who had got themselves in a whole load of trouble in New York City and feel called by God to go and do something to help. That idea that an individual could be somewhere over there, hear something, have something put on their heart by God, because the people over there were on God's heart, right? And go to New York City, and he set up a ministry that's still going to this day and working. And that revolutionized my sense of what it meant to be a Christian, and it really still drives kind of how I feel about today, which is kind of why I want you to think about that too. What might it be that God might be putting on your heart at this moment in time in the life of the United Methodist Church? And how might God be calling you to be used in this moment? Okay, it's not going to look the same for everybody, and we always get the chance, the option to say no. But maybe there is something. By January 2021, I'd been home for 9 months. And I was getting a little bit antsy, shall we say. And I got up one Sunday morning and I said to Kate, I need to go for a drive. And so I don't know about you when you get antsy and you need to go to for a drive, but what I do is I drive to the local Methodist churches. Don't ask, but I do. So I had mapped out, because as I said, I like maps, and I had mapped out the closest United Methodist churches to where we live in Sunset Beach. And they weren't even meeting on Sunday mornings. There was nobody there. But I turned up in the parking lot, and I just kind of pondered and prayed and wondered, what are the people like that meet in this congregation? What are their hearts? What are the ministries they're excited about? What would they think of me if I turned up on a Sunday morning in my full queerness, you know? A couple of them had already scrubbed out the word united and put a fish symbol over the top of it. And another one didn't even have the word United Methodist on it, and I'm thinking, oh, I think they even got ahead of 2553. I'm like, they had made their decision, but I stopped outside another one, and they were still United Methodist. And then, I don't know, I did that a couple of Sundays, I guess, just drove around and sat in the parking lot of churches, pondering. And then in January of 2022, this past January, I thought, you know, it's time to actually go visit some of these churches. So one Sunday morning I got up and I drove to this little church about half an hour inland from us, little rural church, and went to worship with them. It was a little family church, and I walked in and they showed me a seat. They were very kind and invited me to come to Sunday school afterwards, and we did Sunday school. And by the end of the morning, I had told them who I was. I told them I was married to Kate. I didn't hide who I am. I don't. I told them that I worked for Reconciling Ministries Network, but I wasn't there to make them a reconciling church. I was just there to be in connection and relationship. And I've done that with 5 other churches now too. In the area, I just turn up, go to church, go to Sunday school, have a conversation, and just listen and learn and see who's there and what kind of conversations are they having. The one church I went back, they do a fried chicken dinner, and I went and helped for 6 hours serving potato salad. Let me just tell you, that's a lot of potato salad. But they have people driving for miles for this fried chicken dinner. They have a room off the side of the church just for frying the chicken. I'm serious. But I spent 6 hours talking. And by now, not only did they know Kate, but they were talking about their families, and Kate wasn't with me, but, you know, we were building relationship. And, you know, it was good. I loved them. They're great people. I went back another few weeks later, and I went into Sunday school, and they had a Global Methodist Church handout on the table. Oh, I was like, oh. I said to the lay leader, I said, really? And he said, well, you the one that told us we had to have dialogue, Helen, which I had. I'd been telling them they needed to talk. I said, that would make me really sad, you know. It really would. He said, yeah, I know. Well, now they've invited me to give them feedback on their process about what they're going to do. And so who knows what they're going to do and where they will land. And I just tell this story because, you know, I'm not suggesting that everyone should be going off and visiting other churches on a Sunday morning, but if you want to, think about it. Because there's something about the connectional nature of this church that we somehow have lost a little bit of, you know? And it's not that I'm not trying to persuade them to be something they're not, but I am trying to get them to think about who they really are. And can a church that was really so welcoming to me, you know, would it be right for them to choose to go to a denomination that is going to be, you know, committed to not including folks like me? So, all to say, I think we all have a part to play. And if you feel like traveling around some churches, give me a call and let me know how it goes. I think it's good work to be done. All right, I want to quickly, because we're going to have time for questions. There is another handout somewhere. Have you already handed it out? Have people already got it? Would you mind? This is my cue. Oh, could you please? Okay, yes, would you please? Thank you. All right, I just want to, I've got a quick handout. It's only one page. It's double-sided. I want to let you know what RMN's doing right now. I told you a little bit about what the last 2 years were like. So the organizing team at RMN has been working on this engagement toolkit, and on one part of the handout that I've given you, there's the link to how to get it. And what we've been really focusing on is how can we equip people, no matter what context they find themselves in, to engage in dialogue in this moment in time. Bishop Cameron has already outlined the different situations local churches and conferences are finding themselves in, the things we're waiting for, decisions from Judicial Council. And sometimes that can feel like everything's out of our control. But actually, there's still a lot of agency that we have, and there's still a lot that we can do. So, in the toolkit, you'll find, and I'm just gonna, you won't see it because I haven't given you the whole toolkit. I've given you the link to the toolkit, right? But in the toolkit, there is information about the current situations in general and jurisdictional annual conferences. And then there's a section on local church, and it gives you ideas of how you can engage in dialogue and conversation depending on the context you find yourself in. The area in the document, we're still working on it. This document, when you go to the link, it's a Google document that we're constantly updating because we're still working on it, right? We keep adding things to it. But there's a section in there, particularly for folks that are in churches where there are diverse theological perspectives. And that, honestly, is most of our United Methodist churches, right? And so I know that this church, I'm confident about where this church is going to be. Let's just say that. This church is going to be a United Methodist church, am I right? Yes. I think so. But maybe some of you are from churches that are not this church, and maybe some of you are in churches that are much more theologically diverse. Maybe a lot of you know people who go to some churches like that. So if you know people who go to churches like that and they're looking for help, what I would implore you is this. This is not a time to be silent. This is a time to be in conversation and dialogue. As we've been talking about at Reconciling Ministries for years now, this is a time to be in graceful engagement with the people you sit in pews with on a Sunday morning, to engage them in dialogue about your hopes for the United Methodist Church, to give them all the balanced information about what's in front of us right now, to help them, help the church have a real discernment process around what the next steps are. One of the things that I fear, and it has been happening in some places, is that there has been only one side presented, and it hasn't been the side of the future United Methodist Church. And too often, folks like us are too timid to speak up and say something. And we really need to get courageous right now. And maybe, again, most of you are here, and so you don't have to worry about that. But please think about the folks you know, who you can maybe pass this information on to. But there is much, much more information in here about how to engage in those conversations, the kinds of things that should be included in a discernment process. We've included questions for a congregational survey that might help with the conversation, and a lot more besides. This is also a time, I think, to consider about whether it's time to become a reconciling church. And maybe this is a question for First United Methodist in Waynesville. Maybe this is a time to declare that you align yourself with other churches that have become reconciling churches. It's not a good time for most churches to do that. Let me be clear, right? I'm a realist right now. To start a conversation about becoming reconciling in a congregation right now is, in a lot of situations, not the right thing to do. It's more about a conversation about staying United Methodist, right? But in some places, it is the right conversation, and maybe that's the case here, or maybe it's not, but I'd love you to think about it. There's a great resource on our resourceumc.org. I didn't actually put this on the handout, but resourceumc.org has a whole ton of resources under the hashtag BUMC. So if you get asked questions about what United Methodist Church is like, what's it going to be like, and so on and so forth, there's a ton of great resources there, and I highly recommend you take a look at those. So I'm not going to get into the details because we're running out of time and we want time for questions. Yes, that's about right. But I do recommend this document to you. There's also links on there if you want to sign up to become an individual Reconciling United Methodist. And there's also, of course, because we are a non-profit, a link on there if you would like to donate. And my contact information is there too. But please don't count yourself out of having a role at this moment in time. We all have a part to play. And I would encourage you to consider whether today you want to choose to say yes to what God might be calling you to do, to help our future United Methodist Church, which will eventually, hopefully, acknowledge the full humanity of LGBTQ+ people, to play a part in that. So thank you.
Thank you, Helen. There'll be just a little change around. We're going to get a mic for people to be able to speak, and just hang on a second. Turn it on there. Yeah, we have a few minutes, so if you have a question, and you might direct it either to Helen or to Charlene, that would be helpful. There's a hand back here, fifth row over.
I think it could probably be to either of you, but that's one of the things that you talked about, Bishop Camerman, had to do with the Wesley Covenant Association, saying that they're going to stay in the United Methodist Church, even though they're the ones who have organized, put together, the Global Methodist Church. Now, I'm a kind of person who always says, follow the money. And I happen to know that one of those proposals that's going to be presented at the UN, at the General Conference, whenever that happens, has to do with what kind of money will be transferred to the Global Methodist Church. And I don't think that that group should be allowed to stay in the United Methodist Church if it's already left. I am really concerned about this. It has to do with a lot of money, folks. We're not talking about nickels and dimes here. We're talking about $25 million. And it makes me very angry. So if you could speak to, am I right? Am I wrong? What's the deal?
You are referring to part of the protocol process that emerged between the Call 219 General Conference and the one we're still trying to have. And that was a negotiated proposal to come before the next General Conference with a trained mediator. It included 16 persons, bishops, clergy, laity, from both the U.S. and Central Conferences. And one of the terms of the protocol, if that legislation passes before the next General Conference, was that the Global Methodist Church, I believe at that time it did not have a name, but the group that left would be given $25 million as an expression of grace and leave-taking by the United Methodist Church. There was also a figure of $13 million that would be set aside from denominational funding budget for the work of justice ministries ongoing in the United Methodist Church, particularly racial ethnic caucuses. Now, the protocol agreement, it became legislation. It will be before the delegates. It's not the only new structure to be looked at by the delegates, and it will be heavily debated whenever General Conference meets. I'm aware from listening, from overhearing bishops and friends across the church that there is a lot of disagreement now about the protocol, about the money that was mentioned for the Global Methodist Church and other parts of it. So I don't know. That is not a commitment that's been made because General Conference has not acted on it. So while we hear the passion, we don't know, but that is a proposal. And the $25 million is a terrific amount of money. However, when we look at the properties and institutions of this church, it's not very much when you sell a few pieces of property. I'm just going to lay that out there. I hear your passion I don't know what the church will do with that. Helen, I don't know if you have further word to say.
No, that's so
Bishop-
anything that goes to General Conference isn't decided until the delegates vote on it. So it may look very different by the time the
I
vote
understand that, but if the Wesleyan Covenant Association is allowed to stay in the United Methodist Church, even though they've already started the Global Methodist Church, they're staying for the money. And I think they should be asked to leave and not be a part of that general conference.
They're not an official group recognized now, and yet they have given life and leadership in the life of the church. Who would ask them to go? Who has that authority? And I would have to ask myself and all of us, do we want to be about excluding anyone who has chosen to separate from us? It's a very tough question.
Thank you. Some other comment or question. Have to wave your arm so we can see.
It's kind of dark in the back there.
Yes.
From both sides.
There are waving of fingers and hands back here. Lewis, have you found the person?
This is a question for Bishop Camera. Yesterday I received a phone call by a very disturbed member that I'd served way back in the 20th century in one of the churches I served. And his church has leadership, namely the senior pastor, who has been working for months, if not years, on behalf of the concept of the GMC. And he's brought in various people who are spokespersons for just that perspective, and no other perspective has been entertained. This week, they are undergoing a vote on whether you are willing to stay or to leave the United Methodist Church. And the voting is something like a church conference, which I think Jay, superintendent, has to give the authority to do a church conference. I don't know whether they got that from a district superintendent. I kind of doubt it. But anyway, the vote is in process, and the question was raised, what about people like my friend who is homebound? He's a little older than I am. And they then did another statement saying, if you're homebound, you can vote, but you need to have your ballot by coming by the church, which he did yesterday, and he voted to stay with the United Methodist Church. But anyway, I began to quiz him about what does the church know about some of the things, Bishop, you talked about, namely, they had not been paying their apportionments of late, so they'd have to do all of that. They're maybe not aware of what they would owe Westpath, and that whole range of questions that you were certainly articulating so well. My question is, are they voting out of order? Do they have what will they do with that vote? I just don't understand why they're doing it and by what authority they have a right to take that vote. It's dividing the church considerably.
Thank you for that example of what is happening on the ground at some United Methodist churches and some places, not all places. I believe if that vote were communicated to the Western North Carolina Conference or tried to be before the body, it would have to be ruled out of order because the procedures would not have been followed. And sadly to me, hearing this, it sounds like the pastor has been unduly influenced and maybe given misinformation about what they needed to do. And that would be very sad if a pastor, and I'll just be gracious and say unintentionally, led his people to believe it would be a simple matter like this. And so I do not believe that would be properly before the annual conference if it comes down the pike. They would have to begin that process again, George.
Yeah, Pat?
My question is something to do with what we just talked about. At annual conference last year, when we voted to accept the withdrawal, hello.
You have to be real close to it.
Last year at annual conference, there were about 6 churches that was withdrawing from our conference. I voted for it to accept their withdrawal. Does that mean to just be presented, they have already done everything they needed to do?
That would be my understanding, and now they're in a waiting posture to unite with someone else or to become independent. I did not mention that as a route, but there are a good number of United Methodist churches that have voted just to become independent at the end of their process. Not to go the GMC route, not to remain United Methodist, but to be independent. And in those situations, most of them are taking their pastor with them.
Some other question or comment? Okay. One. Yes. Give her authority.
If the churches have gone through the process and they've done all the things that you listed, then will they take the property with them? So
It's possible they can, yes. If they've cleared all their debts, if they've arranged their responsibilities to provide the pension payments for all past and current clergy who've served that church in the United Methodist system, and if they've paid back the annual conference, if they ever got a church loan or any other special consideration, checked off all those things, gone through a discernment process, yes, it would be possible. And then, frankly, they're out there on their own. And this part of my concern, real concern, is that as churches go through this process, I believe we're going to see many churches in deep grief who will realize what they had in the connection by mission, by friendship, by a bishop-appointed pastor to the church, by the ability to leverage gifts and resources to the whole world that you have simply by being United Methodist. That is not going to be on the landscape anymore unless it is a huge megachurch already who has that kind of capacity, and that will be very, very few in number.
okay. My second question is about clergy. If a church chooses to go with a global, whatever they are,
Methodist church.
global Methodist church, or if they become independent and the pastor decides to go with the church, then they are not credentialed with the United Methodist Church any longer.
That is correct. They would have to surrender their credentials, and that literally means that you take your paper of ordination signed by the bishop and the authorities of the conference the year you were ordained to the office of the bishop, or mail it. And from that moment it's received, you are no longer United Methodist clergy.
Is there a provision that if a church leaves and say 5 years down the road they realize what they're missing, can they come back? Could the clergy change their mind?
Yes and yes. That's not written in legislation My response is, of course the United Methodist people, United Methodist churches would welcome persons back. We've already done that in other kinds of circumstances. And clergy in our body globally have left the UMC, felt called to be part of another denomination or another special work, and then come back to so we already do that. We're a church that's open to that, and it would have to be worked out. None of that's on paper yet, but I'm highly confident that we'll figure out a way to do it for those who might make that request.
We have time for one more person. Yes, Anna.
It's just a quick question about the percentages that you mentioned, 50 plus 1, if a church wishes to disaffiliate at the annual conference.
Right.
What is the number of the vote of an individual church to disaffiliate?
That requires a 2/3.
That's what I
majority.
thought.
It's a
I just
higher
wanted to
threshold.
verify that.
Do you have any guesstimate on what percentage will go with the GMC?
The bishops individually, I believe, have a sense of that in his or her annual conference. As a whole body, we have not seen that clarity. In the last month, we have seen a chart by annual conference of expected departures, but even that isn't totally accurate right now. There's still fluidity. And I will say that from what I've seen, by far, it would be more smaller membership churches who seem to be in this path, and far more churches than pastors from what I can tell at this point.
Yes, right here.
Hearing information is not getting to the local churches, and maybe information that maybe the pastor emphasis is maybe not both sides. Is there a path that is being laid out? I mean, May 1, and with the WCA staying intact, to basically recruit and continue to do their work. And I think everybody should have a place where they feel safe and they want to go. But if we're not being proactive about all the DSs, rounding up all the pastors and making sure that there are questions and information that is given from the pulpit, is that in place?
It's in place, but it's not been, quote, enforced. It would be very hard to enforce that. I would say the majority of the bishops are leading their cabinets in that direction to strongly encourage local church pastors to have those series of meetings, help lead the conversations. If they don't feel comfortable doing that for any reason, they can have the DS come, they can have someone from the bishop's staff come. That's happening in a lot of places. Some annual conferences are way out there in how successful they've been in that, but it's not standardized across the connection. And I would say part of that with the May 1st date, that was not anticipated. It was all leading up to the next general conference. So the Global Methodist Church leadership has announced only in the last couple of months that they will launch May 1st regardless of what else happens in the church.
If I might suggest, all of the examples that have been brought here this evening reinforce my call to you all to say, you all know people in some of these churches, right? So please consider yourselves sent. Because some people will reach out and ask for help. We're getting emails at RMN constantly. What do we do? This is happening. I had an email yesterday from somebody. She was one of only two no votes in her church that voted not to leave. So we're getting emails constantly, but there are many, many poor who don't really necessarily know who to reach out to. So what if you were the reacher-outers, right? You've all probably been in other United Methodist churches. Many of you are retired clergy. We've been having a conversation recently about, this may be controversial, but there's a strict rule about not interfering in other people's ministries, right? There's a language around it. But we have been discussing whether or not that rule should be set aside when you see a United Methodist pastor actively working to remove their church from the United Methodist Church. I think maybe there might be a case to be made that actually interfering in somebody's ministry at that point is your duty as a United Methodist. So I'm putting that out there. Controversial?
That is a chargeable offense for any pastor to interfere with the ministry of another United Methodist pastor. It is also true for bishops, Helen.
I'm getting a look.
So what I'm saying is that the bishops are also accountable for that if they are not modeling, leading, encouraging their annual conferences.
To stay in the United Methodist Church.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. So, I like that. So we're on the same page, I think, essentially.
We're on the same page.
Okay, I love that. Phew.
The conversation continues. I want to thank, on your behalf, both Helen and Charlene for this wonderful conversation. And you're free to stay to speak with them individually. If you'd like a copy of Journeying Toward Reconciliation, we have some of those copies up front. Thank you so much. And now may the Spirit of God in the risen Christ lead you in peace and toward a life of reconciliation. In Christ's name, amen.